And we're live here on CAN TV. Bob Schwartz, veteran LGBT activist with the Gay Liberation Network and civil rights activist, and just a long-time activist in a variety of struggles. Marched with Dr. Martin Luther King here in Chicago, facing the white racists.
And in Selma, Alabama.
And in Selma, Alabama, and a long-time member of not only the Gay Liberation Network, but also ACT UP before it, and has seen quite a few radical movements in your day.
Yes, and I'm here with the co-founder of Gay Liberation Network, Andy Thayer, well-known Chicago activist, not only for LGBT rights, but the many other issues that we support because we believe in solidarity politics, and we see that that essentially various movements are connected by their opposition to the owners and operators of the United States. So, should we begin with a description of?
Well, how about we make an announcement what's happening on June 30th, okay? And this is going to be coming up on your screen. Sorry for those of you on Facebook Live, you can't see the screen aside from the green screen behind us. Yeah, it's nice on TV, but they only get to see green screen. So, coming up on the June 30th.
June 30th is the annual Gay Pride, the LGBT Pride Parade in Chicago. Our theme this year is Stonewall Was a Rebellion Against Police Brutality. We will be meeting at the
Uptown Target.
Uptown Target, which is just south of the Wilson Red Line stop.
Yes, 4466 North Broadway.
At 11 o'clock.
11 o'clock. So join us there. If you want more information, you can email us at lgbtliberation@aol.com. But back to the topic. We're talking about Stonewall 50 years on,
Stonewall.
1969. Bob, tell us, what was Stonewall?
Well, Stonewall was a rebellion against police brutality. It occurred for 3 nights at the end of June in 1969, 50 years ago. At the end of this month. Here are some pictures. The very few pictures were taken of the rebellion, of the uprising. These are among the very few that were taken outside the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar, kind of a dive bar, in Greenwich Village in New York City. There was a very diverse crowd there. Drag queens, street kids, lesbians. Sometimes there are arguments about who threw the first brick at Stonewall, who was most prominent, who was in the leadership, and these questions tend to divert attention from the importance of Stonewall. And Mr. Thayer will comment on what it was about Stonewall that made it different from other LGBT rebellions or events, protests that had occurred prior to 1969, but they're not as well known, and there's a reason for that.
Well, and the reason is this. I mean, first, Stonewall, as Bob mentioned, was not the only LGBT riot of the time. There was the famous, at least amongst LGBT historians, Compton Cafeteria riot in 1966 in San Francisco, but there were at least 2 other rebellions that we know of LGBT people rioting in response to violent police raids, which were very typical of the time. I mean, this the 1960s, the 1950s before them, and going all the way back into the beginning of the 20th century, LGBT bars were very commonly raided by police departments right around the country, including here in Richard J. Daley's Chicago. It was a common experience, and the mafia-owned bars, and they were almost exclusively mafia-owned bars, would pay off the cops, and so that would keep the raids at bay. But what would happen during these raids is the cops would not only beat people up, but perhaps even more severely, they would out LGBT employees to their employers, to their families. People would lose their housing, they'd lose their jobs. It was newspapers such as our own Chicago Tribune would very commonly list the names and home addresses of those who were arrested. And really, these were minor, quote-unquote, offenses, but they would make victims of the people attacked by publicizing who they were, by outing them.
There were some suicides too that occurred as a result of these outings.
Yes. So what happened in a handful of instances, and we know of at least 4, but there are probably more, that people fought back. People started throwing bricks. People started beating up the cops in response to the beatings that they received. And for Stonewall, at least for a handful of nights in Greenwich Village in 1969, people rioted. Now, so what happened in Stonewall was not at all unique. What made it unique was what people did in the months afterwards. They began organizing on a very different basis than the old, what had been termed the homophile movement, the very conservative in many respects movement which had preceded the gay liberation movement, which was rebirthed by the 1969 Stonewall Rebellion. And the politics that people took into that movement were radically different from that previous movement. And that has everything to do with what activists were influenced by in those critical years of 1968 and 1969. All histories of the early gay liberation movement point out that it was heavily populated by veterans of mainly the anti-war movement, but also the women's liberation movement and also the civil rights movement. Like Bob here himself was a member of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, joined the gay movement later than some of the Stonewall activists, but still had what events in those other movements had a profound effect on why people responded to Stonewall much more differently than the previous riots. And the events that I think really stand out are the April 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King and the late August 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention. MLK's murder showed that no matter how passively, peacefully, or whatever people tried to treat the racist government and society in this country, still he was assassinated. The anti-war movement, in terms of its effects, influence on the Chicago 68 Democratic Convention, is a little bit more complicated because you had not only the assassination of Kennedy, the second Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, earlier that year, but then you had the other so-called anti-war candidate, I use heavy quotes there, because when there's a Democrat claiming to be anti-war, you sure as hell can't count on that. And in spite of these 2 anti-war candidates, quote-unquote, winning all the primaries and winning about 3/4 of the primary votes, Richard J. Daley not only knocked heads in the streets of our city and basically erased the First Amendment right to assemble in our city, but inside the Chicago Democratic Convention, his thuggery was also on display as they rammed through a pro-war candidate, Hubert Humphrey, in spite of the overwhelming sentiment, as evidenced in the Democratic parties, for an anti-war nominee. That led a lot of anti-war activists who would later become members of the Gay Liberation Front organizations, which grew up post-Stonewall, to conclude that basically the establishment was bankrupt, its parties, the Democratic and of course the Republican Party being headed by the far right-winger Richard Milhouse Nixon, that they were both bankrupt. If we're going to stop this war, if we're going to win liberation for ourselves on the issues of whether women's liberation, black liberation, or gay liberation, as it turned out, we have to do it ourselves. Self-emancipation. That was really the ethos of those handful of years from 1968 to about 1973. And the gains were enormous. There are gains that are being rapidly erased today, but it's important to note that, for example, the Black Panther Party survival programs forced the racist Nixon administration to quintuple the food stamp program. Affirmative action was rolled out on a national scale to an extent never seen before that and since as well. A Nixon-packed Supreme Court granted the right to abortion in 1973, thanks to a mass women's movement deciding that we have to make the change ourselves. And that is really the key to why that era was so critical for rebirthing the gay movement, this time on a mass scale. Never before seen in U.S. history. There had been a small organization formed here in the early 1920s, here in Chicago. It was rapidly repressed, and then, of course, the Mattachine Society and Daughters of Bilitis, that were two so-called homophile organizations formed in the early 1950s, but they were both small. The gay liberation movement birthed out of Stonewall with this radical new politics, with this ethos of we're not going to entreat the politicians to hopefully do things for us, but we're going to force them to do the change.
I think it should be pointed out in terms of the radical politics of the Gay Liberation Front, and it's that group that our organization, the Gay Liberation Network, is trying to emulate, not only in our name, but in our radical politics. The Gay Liberation Front won the support of the Black Panthers because they supported the struggle for black rights. And then, just a few years ago, there was concern in California that some African Americans there were not supporting equal marriage rights for LGBT folk, but it was demonstrated that LGBT folk in California were not supporting black rights. So,
You're thinking of 2008.
Yeah, that was much more recent.
Yeah.
But there's a lesson that needs to be learned again and again, apparently.
Solidarity politics, what today we call intersectionality. The early gay liberation movement was not siloed the way that we see so many movements today. As Bob mentioned, the Gay Liberation Front organizations organized numerous actions in support of the Black Panther Party as it was being mowed down by police, racist police departments around the country. As you saw some of those graphics on the screen there, sorry, Facebook Live folk, there LGBT people who were active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, in spite of many in the movement being homophobic themselves. But as I said, many of the early Gay Liberation Front activists were themselves, like Bob here, part of the anti-war movement and wanted their voices heard within the movement, demanded that their voices be heard in the movement in spite of the homophobia. And really, that is why the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense became the first major organization in the United States that wasn't officially LGBT to endorse gay liberation. Huey P. Newton came out with a very famous statement, I believe it was 1970 or 71, where he endorsed gay liberation, enforced a reckoning on whole sections of the U.S. homophobic left at the time to rethink those politics and see how the politics of homophobia intersected with the politics of sexism. And really, while there were legislative gains of various sorts, but one by the other movements, the environmental movement, for example, we saw a dramatic recasting of things like the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts and the Endangered Species Act, the establishment of the EPA, all under the pro-big business Richard Milhous Nixon. The LGBT movement's major gain of that era was establishing a public face for the movement that young LGBTs around the country could readily join. It prompted millions of people eventually to come out of the closet, established the LGBT movement for the first time since the Great Depression, when the movement in an earlier time had been wiped out by the rise of the Great Depression as well as Nazism in Europe. It reestablished our movement for the first time in a mass basis, and that's why, really, we have an international LGBT movement of sorts. I mean, it takes very different forms in different countries, and the United States is by far from the leader, I think, in terms of the politics of that movement. One great example I like to point to is the South African LGBT movement, where South African LGBTs very early saw the importance of intersectionality, endorsed the fight against apartheid, even though doing so was illegal and subjected you to imprisonment and so forth. And as a result, South Africa, once it won majority rule, at least in terms of ethnicity, became the first country in the world to have LGBT rights enshrined in its constitution, something that we here in the United States still don't have.
No.
The question is, and we're getting down to the end of our hour, I think we should talk about what does the Stonewall movement, what can it teach us for today's fairly dire political circumstances?
Well, I was going to mention some things that Stonewall was not.
Mm-hmm. You go for that.
It was not Budweiser beer trucks parading down Fifth Avenue in New York or on Belmont Street in Chicago. It was not supposedly gay-friendly politicians parading as they do at the front of the parade in Chicago. Mm-hmm. It was not gay cops or straight cops. There were no cops in the original Stonewall, except the cops who were creating misery for the patrons at the Stonewall Inn. Mm-hmm. And there are movements in a number of cities, including New York, unfortunately not in Chicago, to exclude politicians, to exclude cops who continue to oppress people in the LGBT community.
Especially people of color and trans people.
Not to mention people of color. There are ongoing headlines of police brutalizing people of color. And yet there are people in the LGBT community in Chicago who welcome police to participate in the parade. Well, they should be excluded.
There has been a takeover of the movement long ago in this city and most cities around the country of the upper crust, shall we say, the ruling class, LGBTs, disproportionately white, certainly wealthy, certainly connected to power, and certainly having none of the solidarity politics that we saw in the early Stonewall movement of being against U.S. control of other areas of the world, being steadfastly in favor of, for example, Vietnamese running their own country as opposed to cheerleading gay troops, quote-unquote, serving us. People in the manner of Chelsea Manning who recognize that you can't allow others to be oppressed and exposing U.S. war crimes. In terms of the movement today, I think in some respects we face a situation somewhat reminiscent of what happened after the passage of the great civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s, where a section of blacks, a more privileged section, a tiny layer of blacks who were more privileged than the rest of that community, basically bought in with the system, bought in with the Democratic Party, and made careers for themselves, oftentimes at the expense of others in their community. And we see that in the LGBT movement, I think, especially in the wake of the passage of equal marriage rights by the Supreme Court, but even well before that. People like Congressman Barney Frank, who endorsed, for example, he actually introduced Bill Clinton's Don't Ask, Don't Tell measure into Congress as a so-called reform, under which, as we now know, many more people were purged from the military than under the previous policy. They tried to mute criticism of Clinton and the Democratic Party when they endorsed the Defense of Marriage Act that was used as a cudgel against us for many, many years afterwards. You have a section of people that are well off in the community who decide they've got theirs. But we also have to remember that in the wake of that section of folks doing that, it was in the mid-60s, I believe it was 66, may have been 65, when the radical Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was formed. And even though there wasn't even a chapter of the Black Panthers here in Chicago during the time of the 68 convention, just over a year later, the FBI, in conjunction with the Chicago Police Department, was organizing the murder of the Illinois Black Panthers, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. The Black Panthers, as of January 1970, were 10,000 strong. So out of that wreckage of a section of a community deciding it's got its own and is going to basically crap on the rest of us, there can be radical organizations reborn out of that wreckage, as we saw with the Black Panther Party, and we saw the great era of the 68 to 73, where so many gains were won by the black movement, by the women's movement, by the gay movement, by the environmental movement, by the labor movement, on and on and on. All the sort of things that we see being erased today had made sweeping, rapid gains. And I think that the basic lesson that we have to learn from the Stonewall era movements is that even if you've got a far-right politician in power, at the time it was Richard Milhouse Nixon, today we've got Donald Trump, even when you've got jerks like that in office who are so steadfastly against us, you can make gains. You don't have to wait to 2020. In fact, the strength of those movements was that they were independent of both parties. People were not waiting for the 72 elections to make the change that they wanted in 1968-69. They were making it themselves, and I think that's the lesson that today's activists who are hoping for salvation from the Democrats in 2020 need to really take a look at, because the Democrats will sell you right down the river and have so many times on abortion rights and a whole series of things.
Well, the key thing here, or at least a part of what needs to be done, is that politics in the United States has to be understood as something other than elections, something other than walking into a voting booth every 2 years or every 4 years. Now, elections could be a component of what's really necessary, and that is a mass movement for change, as Andy has pointed out. The anti-war movement, the black rights movement, the labor movement, the LGBT movement that exploded after Stonewall. Movement is the key word, not elections.
People making the change for themselves.
People making change for themselves. People participating in their own liberation. This is the key component of a new politics.
Well, I'm afraid that we're getting down to the end of the show here. We want to make one last plug for the Gay Liberation Network contingent in the Pride Parade here. Oops. Got some pictures of Chicago 68 for those of you watching. There we go. Stonewall, the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion. We're having a contingent in the Chicago's Pride Parade themed around Stonewall was a rebellion against police brutality. Please join us on Sunday, June 30th, 11 a.m. at 4466 North Broadway Avenue. That's right in front of the Uptown Target. You can meet us there. Look for the guy with the pride flag that leads you to our contingent and join in a radical rewriting of the history, rewriting of the Pride Parade that's going to be happening on Sunday, June 30th at 11 a.m. If you need to get more information about it, you can email us at lgbtliberation@aol.com. And with that, thank you, Bob Schwartz, Mark Lawrence in the booth, who's helping us out with today's show. And we'll be seeing you again in about a month's time, if not at the Pride Parade.